Hello, my name's John Mann. I'm part of the Ipswich Vineyard preaching team, and I just wanted to record a copy of a sermon I did a little bit before Christmas at Ipswich Vineyard Church called Christmas Unwrapped. It's a reflection on the Christmas story and hopefully some new ways to think about it. The subtitle to this sermon would be Finding God in Unexpected Places. Now, you may have read in the news recently about a book published last month called The Fadden Moor Psalter, The Discovery and Conservation of a Medieval Treasure. It tells of how a book of Psalms from around 800 CE was found in an Irish bog in July 2006. It was hailed as one of the most significant Irish archaeological finds in decades. It was in fact the first discovery of an Irish early medieval manuscript in 2 centuries, and it was uncovered by a bulldozer driver, Eddie Fogarty, who was extracting peat with his JCB. So you see, he was pretty on the ball to be in a JCB and notice that he'd just managed to dig up a book of Psalms, and fortunately he was able to, he covered it up again because he realised it must have been kind of kept safe being in the bog, and apparently if he'd have just left it open and gone off to tell people about it, maybe also he wanted to hide it, I'm not sure, but anyway, the fact is he covered it up again, and it kind of preserved it, although it still took a lot of time to restore it. I mean, it was a book kept in a bog. But anyway, they managed to restore it, and the book that is written about it is all about how they managed to conserve it. So what made me think of this in terms of the Christmas story is signs of God appearing where we least expect them, finding God in unexpected places. For the JCB driver to be able to suddenly see this psalm book in the middle of a bog, it's like 1,000 years old, right? Over 1,000 years old. So, and yet this sort of sign of God, if you like, that it had been preserved for so long. In the Christmas story, it's about God appearing in unexpected places. God speaks to an old priest, Zechariah, to a young girl, Mary, to an engaged man, Joseph, and to shepherds tending sheep. And perhaps most unexpected of all, God appears as a baby in a manger. So all through the Christmas story, we're getting God appearing where people don't expect God to be appearing. Now, I'm going to share some slides with this, so hopefully you can see the slide now. Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth to Galilee in Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. Now, you might remember that in a previous sermon I said that life in the kingdom of God requires that we change our way of thinking. And I'd like us to perhaps change a few of the ways we've been traditionally trained to understand the Christmas story. Note in the text that we just read, it says, whilst they were there, referring to Bethlehem. So very often we think that Mary is pregnant, she's just sort of about to give birth as they arrive in Bethlehem, and they're desperately looking around for somewhere to stay so that the baby can be born. But the text actually says, while they were there. So in other words, they've gone to Bethlehem, they've got a place to stay, and then whilst they were there, the time came for a child to be born. So it's one important difference is the text indicates that they already have found a place to stay. Okay. Now, the thing about this is that in the Middle East, when a family member travels some distance and comes to visit the traditional family home, so Joseph is descended from the house of Judah. He's not living in Bethlehem, but that's his sort of place of origin of his tribe. And so obviously he's going back and he's going to have family members in Bethlehem. And so Joseph would only have had to say, "This is me, Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mattat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Jannai, the son of Joseph, the son of Matthias, the son of Amos." You know, he can go back and list his family tree. And, families in Bethlehem, somebody would have said, "Oh, we're descended from Amos," or "We're descended from Levi. Come, brother Joseph, and stay with us." So it would have been an important sign of hospitality that if members of the family were coming into the town because of this census, that other family members would be, would want to put them up and want to make sure that they felt welcome. It's an important part of Middle Eastern culture. So when it says while they were there, we would understand that a family member, a family would have put them up, and they would be staying with the family, so there wasn't this no room at the inn business. So the NIV, the translation that we just read, does not say there was no room at the inn. It says there was no guest room available for them. So we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail next. So on this slide you can see what a typical house would have looked like in first century Palestine. Now you can see that there's a door going into the house. You can see that there's a raised platform or terrace on where the family would eat and sleep and live. At the door there's straw on the floor, and there's straw in the manger, which is in the front room, in the main living area. And the cow or the sheep would be brought in at night. They would let out during the day. And at night they would stay in this lower part of the house, and if they wanted to eat anything they would eat from the manger. And the family would sleep on this raised terrace, and the animals would sleep on the floor. So as you can see, there's straw just by the door. So during the night the animals would have been looked after. Now just go on to the next slide. So here's the view from above, as well as the view that we've just seen. So on the left is the view we just looked at. On the right is the new view from the top. So we're now looking down on top, and you can see top right there's a little gap in the wall, which is the door, and then we can see the straw all over the floor. And then you've got a better view now of these sort of four circles, which are the straw for the manger. So the animals can come in at night, they can eat from the manger, and it's right in the middle of the main room of the house, and the rest of the family is up on the raised terrace, and they could have a fire and they would be warm, and they could cook and so on. So this is the sort of house where Mary and Joseph would have been staying. Now here's one more picture. In this one we've got again a top view and a side view. We've got one of the sheep there, top view and side view, eating from the manger, and in this one there's a table and chairs, so as to show where the family would be. So what we've got the picture so far is Mary and Joseph, they've come into Bethlehem, they've been invited to stay in a house like this, and then we get to this verse which talks about what happened when Jesus was born. So let's look at that, because that's the reference to the no room at the inn verse. So it isn't when they arrived that there was no room, it was when Jesus was born. It's then that it starts saying there was no room. So here you can see the Greek word, New Testament is written in Greek. The Greek word, often translated as inn, is kataluma, and this literally just means a place to stay. So it's a very general word. And as you can see, it's used in two other places in the New Testament, and in both these places it refers to a guest room or an upper room. In Mark 14 and in Luke 22 it's used for the upper room where Jesus and his disciples celebrate the Last Supper. And you might also remember that in Luke 10 there's the story of the Good Samaritan, and that features an inn. That verse is not listed here, and that's because Luke 10 uses the traditional Greek word for inn, which is pandokion. So if Luke had wanted to say there was no room at the inn, he would have used that word, because that's the word he uses in the Good Samaritan parable. But obviously he doesn't, so he doesn't mean that he doesn't want to refer to an inn. He isn't claiming that there was an inn. And so now we can go back and say, well, so in verse 7 it says they placed him in a manger because there was no room in the guest room. Now the guest room or upper room would have been, if there was one, would have been at the top of the house. And I think we could assume that if there was no room in the guest room, some other people who'd come in for the census would have occupied that. So the guest room was already occupied, they need somewhere to put the baby, and so that's why they had to use the manger. But it wasn't in a stable, it was in a house, it was in the living room, and it's just saying, well, we couldn't put the baby in the guest room, we had to put the baby in the manger. So this really shows how easy it is for us to read something with a particular lens or a particular way of thinking. We come to the text with a set of expectations, and if we read the text carefully we can find it actually says something quite different to what we're used to. But we're so used to the traditional gospel story that we've probably happily read these verses in Luke many times and not actually noticed that it's describing something different to the traditional nativity story. So hopefully that is interesting to see what it would have been really like for when Jesus was born, and also to help us kind of think a little bit about, sometimes we read a text but we've got certain assumptions or certain expectations, and we need to try and be a little bit more open to the text actually telling us something different than what we're used to. Right, now I want to move on and look at shepherds. If you've read the Old Testament, you're familiar with shepherds having quite an honourable place in the Old Testament. David was a shepherd. He became King David. He started off as a shepherd boy. And the 23rd Psalm says, "The Lord is my shepherd." So it might surprise you to learn that in the first century Palestine, at the time of Jesus' birth, shepherds were not a well-respected profession by any means. The rabbis had written up lists of prescribed trades, which is trades that all good Jews should avoid. And the rabbis said if you were in one of those prescribed trades, you probably couldn't keep the law, you couldn't really be a good Jew. And shepherds were on the list. Now the rabbis, it's thought, argued that to be a good person you had to confess every sin that you committed, confess it to God, ask him to forgive you, and make recompense as far as you are able to the person that you've sinned against. And their way of thinking was that a shepherd can't keep a list of all the damage that the sheep does, and so there will be sins the shepherd won't know they've committed, they won't be able to ask God's forgiveness, they also won't be able to make recompense or compensation for the damage done by the sheep. So basically they couldn't be good Jews. The other thing might be that the sheep would wander off and the shepherd would have to go outside the Holy Land. They might come into contact with Gentiles, which potentially could make them unclean. So shepherds were at the time regarded as outsiders to good society, and yet it is to shepherds that angels announce that the Messiah has been born. So apart from Mary and Joseph, and Elizabeth, of course, knows about it, but apart from the immediate family, if you like, God hasn't told the general public, if you like. The family knows what's going on, but God wants to invite others to come and celebrate the birth of Jesus. And who does God rush and tell the good news to? Not to kings, not to religious leaders, not to the important, not to the wealthy, but to these shepherds. God has a special love and compassion for those who have been excluded, those who are marginalised, or those who have been placed on the outside of society, who are regarded as outsiders. Time and again in the Gospel, we find that God turns things upside down, and he turns up in unexpected places. As Mary says in the first chapter of Luke, he has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. God is not bound by religious tradition. Later in the Gospels we find that the religious leaders did not recognise that Jesus had come from God. No doubt they would have refused to acknowledge him at his birth too. When God had a party to celebrate the birth of Jesus, it was the shepherds that he wanted to share it with. So Jesus was not born in a palace, he was born in a regular home, God showing up in unexpected places. In Luke 2:20 it says the shepherds returned after they'd seen Jesus. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, which was just as the angel had told them. So the shepherds were very happy with what they had seen. They were happy with how Mary and Joseph and Jesus were being treated. And they wouldn't have been happy if Mary and Joseph had not been treated with good hospitality, had not been invited into a family home, had been left outside in a cold stable or something like that. It would have been unthinkable for a family to have visited and be treated like that. So just move on to the next slide. So who did God proclaim the good news of Jesus' birth to? Not to the rich, not to the powerful, not to kings or rulers, not to the famous, not to the holy, not to the wise, not to scholars, but to outsiders, the dispossessed, the stranger. It was to them he gave the good news. The way God sees things is not how we usually see them. Every day we need to ask God to change our way of thinking so that we might see things right. Jesus later said, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Mary has great insight as to what God is doing and speaks most eloquently in her song in the first chapter of Luke, which we can see on the slides. Here she is, a pregnant teenage girl. If you look very carefully at the original verses from Luke, it says she was pregnant and she wasn't yet married. And some people think that was a crime guilty of stoning to have been pregnant before getting married. And it's possible that Joseph didn't have to bring Mary down to Bethlehem, but he didn't feel safe leaving her behind just in case the local people turned against her, and so it may be that he felt that he needed to take Mary with him. So she wasn't in a great situation. She was a pregnant teenage girl, and yet even must be feeling as vulnerable as she did. She can say, for he, God, has looked with favour on the humble state of his servant, and from now on all generations will call me blessed. Luke 1:48. So here we are. So just like the ancient book of Psalms turning up in a peat bog and being discovered by a JCB driver, In the Christmas story, God shows up in unexpected places, in a manger in Bethlehem, on the hillside to a group of shepherds. And if we open our eyes, we can see him everywhere. We will see God in places we never expect to find him. And in that encounter, God can birth something special in us. Something amazing, something unexpected, something wonderful. So I'll just finish with a quote from the American Trappist monk Thomas Merton, who said, "Christ is born in us today in order that he may appear to the whole world through us." Thank you.